today, and that is a very important part of your plant physiology. And we know the name of the topic is phytohormones, or I can call it plant hormones. So let us see. We have the that is phytohormones. When I say phyto, that means phyto itself means plants. So whenever I use this term phyto, this is basically what is plants, and hormones we know are signals. So they are the signals. These are the signals which are present in the plants. So we call them as phytohormones. Okay. Now see, when we start with phytohormones, we all have done this. हम 10th class में भी पढ़ते हैं phytohormones. हम 12th में भी पढ़ते हैं. Somebody is from doing BSc, चाहे वो biotech का student हो, चाहे वो zoology में subsidiary, you have to study botany, वहाँ भी phytohormones. और botany वालों को भी phytohormones पढ़ना पड़ेगा. तो certain topics in plants are very important. जैसे photosynthesis, nitrogen metabolism, phytohormones, all these topics are very important. और hormones अपने आप ही बहुत important topic है. Now, when we start with phytohormones, some of the phytohormones that we have already studied in colleges and schools, one we know is auxin. We all know about the auxins. Then we have the cytokinins. We have all studied cytokinins. Then we have gibberellins. We have gibberellins. We have done gibberellins. Let me tell you, gibberellins, it's not a single hormone. In fact, gibberellins, they are a family. They are a family of hormones. We know we have more than 120 different kinds of gibberellins. Do you know that? We have more than 120. That's हम लिखे ना. GA1, आपने सुना होगा GA3, GA2. So we have more than 120 different kinds of gibberellins. So there's a lot of diversity which is present. And then in colleges, we have also studied what is ethylene. And then lastly, what we have done in colleges is ABA. This is abscisic acid. This is abscisic acid. That also we have studied. So which are the hormones we have done? We have done auxins in colleges, cytokinins, gibberellins. We have done ABA. We have done ethylene. These are the important hormones that we have already seen in schools and colleges. Now the question is, see, do you think these are the only hormones? क्या और भी hormones नहीं है हमारे पास? क्या plants only produce these hormones? No. Plants have a variety of other hormones as well that we don't study in colleges. अब हम college में क्या नहीं पढ़ते? What we don't study, see, which hormones that we don't study in colleges. So we have hormones which are called as polyamines. Polyamines. Let me tell you, these polyamines are very important. In fact, let me tell you, these polyamines they're one of the most ancient molecules which are present in organisms. So one of the most evolutionarily most ancient molecules which are present in organisms, they're basically what are polyamines. And they're very important hormones which are required for growth and development of plants. And polyamines, we know, can also be of three types. We have spermine, we have spermidine, and then we have lastly got one which is called as putrescine. So look at three different kinds of polyamines, which are evolutionarily very important molecules. So they are also hormones. We don't know about them. We don't study in colleges. Then we also have important hormones which are called as brachiosteroids. We have brachiosteroids. अब ये जो brachiosteroids हैं, वो भी हम normally colleges में नहीं पढ़ते, ठीक है? Then we have important plant hormones which are called as jasmonic acid. Jasmonic acid, or sometimes we call them as jasmonates. ये भी बहुत important plant hormones है जो again we don't study in colleges. And let me tell you, ये जो jasmonates हैं, they are perfumed hormones. We call them as perfumed phytohormones. So very important. Then we have some other phytohormones. We have a very important phytohormone which has been discovered before a few years, and we call it strigolactone. We have strigolactone. ये भी important hormone है. Then we have phytohormones which are called as coumarins. Coumarins, ये भी हम colleges में नहीं पढ़ते. तो अगर examiner आपको फंसाना चाहे तो वो आराम से फंसा सकता है, क्योंकि एनी नॉर्मल स्टूडेंट वुड ओनली स्टडी दोस 4-5 hormones, ये तो आप छूओगे नहीं कभी. लेकिन if the examiner is very smart, he can ask you question from here also. अभी खत्म नहीं हुए. We have another hormone which is called as salicylic acid. Salicylic acid. So we have variety of other hormones here in the plant here. So देखो कितने सारे हमने hormones की बात की. Look at this. Jasmonic acid, we have jasmonates, we have polyamines, we have salicylic acid, we have racinosteroids, we have trigolactone, we have coumarins. So look at different kinds of hormones. और ये हम कॉलेज में पढ़ते ही नहीं है. ठीक है. So you can yourself see कि phytohormones is a very diverse topic. It is a very big. It's a very diverse topic. ठीक है. And every phytohormone, if you go to the plant physio book, if somebody is from the botany or plants background, and if you look at the plant physio book, we know half of the plant physio book is basically hormones. Every hormone has one or two chapters in the books. ऐसा नहीं कि the entire hormones are single, पूरा सारे hormones का एक ही chapter नहीं. हर hormone का एक या दो chapters होते हैं books में. So half of the book sometimes of plant physio वो आपकी photosynthesis और hormones में खत्म हो जाती है. Is this very clear? So we are starting with phytohormones and we know their signals, important signals in plants. Now, how do you define phytohormone? As we start with the phytohormones, how do we define, what is the definition? How do we define phytohormone? क्या definition देंगे? How do we define them? So I can say, what are phytohormones? Very simple definition. They are a group of naturally occurring organic molecules. क्या कह सकते हैं? हम कह सकते हैं कि they are a group of naturally occurring organic molecules which influence physiological responses, which influence physiological responses. Physiological responses even at, अब ये important है, which influence physiological responses even at, spelling देख लेना, even at very low concentrations, even at micromolar concentrations, even at micromolar concentrations, even at very low concentrations, they are able to influence what? They are able to influence physiological responses in the plants. In the plants. So we call them as phytohormones. So very simple definition. Molecules which influence physiological responses even at micromolar concentration. Okay? Now, see, we have started with the hormones. It's a very vast topic. Okay? Now, when we start with the hormone, the very first hormone, by ABCD कहाँ से start होती है? A से start होती है. A. So let us start with oxygen. क्योंकि ABCD A से start होती है तो हम ऑक्सीजन पढ़ लेते हैं. सबसे पहले हम ऑक्सीजन ही पढ़ते हैं कॉलेजेस में. So let us start with oxygen here. The first hormone that we discuss here, we start with oxygen. Okay. Now the question is, what is an oxygen? How do we define an oxygen? How do we define an oxygen? If somebody says, sir, naturally occurring molecules which influence physiological response, वो तो सभी के लिए है. That definition is true for all the hormones. But the question is, how do we define oxygen? What are oxygens? How do you define an oxygen? So we know oxygens are compounds, or I can say, or oxygens are organic compounds with, so they're compounds with what? They're compounds with aromatic ring. So याद रखना अपने oxygens have aromatic ring. So they are compounds with aromatic ring and a carboxylic acid group. And a carboxylic acid group. So this is simply what is an oxygen. A compound with, we have the aromatic ring and the carboxylic acid group. This is very clear. So that means they have a ring-like structure. And they'll also have what? They'll also have a COOH group. बात समझ में आ गई? So this is simply what is oxygen. अब जब हम oxygens की बात करें, when we talk about oxygens, if I say oxygen, तो कोई ऐसा तो नहीं है कि there's only a single compound which is called as oxygen. It's not so. कि if I have only one compound and I start calling it oxygen, no. In oxygens itself, there's a lot of diversity. जब हम oxygens की बात करते हैं, oxygens itself shows a lot of diversity. There are various compounds which we can claim as oxygens, which can be named as oxygens. And they can fall under two categories. Oxygens can also fall under two categories. One, we have the naturally occurring oxygens, natural. We have the naturally occurring auxins, and one we have the synthetic, man-made. We can call them as artificial. So we have the synthetic man-made auxins, naturally occurring auxins, मतलब they are naturally found in the plants. और कई बार ये क्वेश्चन भी आते हैं एग्जाम में. They'll give you four examples and they'll ask you, okay, which out of them is a synthetic auxin or which out of them is not auxin. बहुत बार ऐसे क्वेश्चन आते हैं एग्जाम में कि इनमें से या कई बार मैचिंग में आ जाते हैं. They'll give you, okay, यहाँ पे 4 कंपाउंड्स दे दिए और यहाँ पे कहते हैं ऑक्सिन, साइटोकाइनिन, जिबरेलिन, एंड they'll ask you to match. तो मैचिंग में कई बार क्वेश्चन आते हैं ऐसे. So this is very puzzling. So let us talk about what are synthetic auxins, which are the example of the naturally occurring auxins. So when I talk about the naturally occurring auxins, the very first thing that comes to my mind, everybody knows this, one of the most abundant auxin in the plants. एक सबसे abundant auxin जो है, one of the most abundant auxins in plants, this is what is IAA, and this is a natural auxin, IAA. Is this clear? What is this? This is IAA stands for, this is indole 3 acetic acid. This is indole 3 acetic acid. So this is one of the most abundant auxins which is found in the plants. Okay. Then we have the second one, which is what? Which is 4-CLIAA. This is also natural. 4-CLIAA. You know the full form. This is 4-chloro. This is 4-chloro indole 3 acetic acid. 4-chloro-indole 3 acetic acid. This is what is 4-CLIAA. So this is also naturally occurring auxin. और कौन सा है? Can you name one? क्या आप मुझे बताओगे? Again, this is also very abundant. ये भी बहुत कॉमन पाया जाता है. स्पेशली आपको पता है विंटर्स के बाद मस्टर्ड होती है. ठीक है, तो मस्टर्ड में भी है ऑक्सिन वेरी कॉमन एंड व्हिच इज कॉल्ड एज IBA. अब याद आ गया आपको IBA, आपने नाम सुना है, एवरीबॉडी नोस. तो IBA, दिस इज आल्सो नेचुरल ऑक्सिन. दिस इज आल्सो नेचुरल एंड व्हाट डू इट स्टैंड्स फॉर? दिस इज इंडोल ब्यूटारिक एसिड. So this is indole butyric acid. So this is also natural. ठीक है, जो मैंने पहले बात करी थी, जैसे मैंने कहा 4-CLIA, ये जो 4-CLIA है, दिस इज abundantly found in the case of P. ये P में ज्यादा abundant होता है. ठीक है, अब मैं बात कर रहा हूँ IBA की. IBA I told you is more abundantly found in mustard. पूरी मस्टर्ड फैमिली में, इनफैक्ट मस्टर्ड फैमिली में. ऑल्सो कॉर्न, जो भुट्टा खाते हो आप, मेज, कॉर्न बोले तो मेज. So IBA is more abundant in these plants, you know. And then we have the next one, which is called as PAA. PAA. This is what? This is phenyl acetic acid. This is phenyl acetic acid. And this is also commonly found in most of the plants. They'll also have PAA. Less in concentration, but they also have what is PAA. So these are some of the important naturally occurring auxins. So we have IAA, 4-CLIA, we have PAA, we have IBA. याद ही हो गया. ठीक है, यही याद कर लो. And then I'm talking about the next category, which is the synthetic auxins. Let us talk about the synthetic auxins. Now, give me some examples of synthetic auxins. Give me some examples of synthetic auxins जो man-made है, artificial है. यार आप लोगों की लगता है प्लांट्स की नॉलेज कम है क्या सबकी?
2,4-D.
So we have, yeah, very important compound, which is what is 2,4-D. This is very important synthetic auxin. This is what stands for, इसकी full form है, this is 2,4-dichlorophenoxyacetic acid. लिख दूं मैं? This is 2,4-dichlorophenoxy, spelling check ACETIC, acetic acid. So this is dichloro. So this is what is 2,4-D. Okay. And 2,4-D, sometimes, you know, this compound, you know, this is also used as a herbicide. पता है आपको? This is also used as a herbicide. If you, you know, spray the plant with large amount of 2,4-D, you know, it can be used as a herbicide. It will defoliate plant. It defoliates. This will defoliate the plant. Defoliate मतलब the leaves will fall. ठीक है, तो लीव को कहते हैं ना foliate मतलब leaves, so it will defoliate मतलब leaves fall. So sometimes we use it as a herbicide. Leaves will fall, plant will not be able to photosynthesize. जब leaves ही नहीं होंगी तो photosynthesis नहीं होगा, जब photosynthesis नहीं होगा तो खाना नहीं बनेगा, तो plant तो ऐसे ही मर जाएगा हमारा. So we use it as a herbicide commonly. So this is a very important synthetic oxygen. And then we have another synthetic oxygen which is called as again very common, NAA. NAA, this is naphthalene acetic acid. This is naphthalene acetic acid. ठीक है. Now this is also what is a synthetic oxygen, NAA. Then we have the other one, dicamba. Dicamba, this is also what is the synthetic oxygen, dicamba. अब फुल फॉर्म इसकी बहुत बड़ी है, नाम तो डाइकेम्बा है लेकिन नाम से मैच नहीं होता फुल फॉर्म. दिस इज 2-methoxy 3,6 डाइक्लोरोबेंजोइक एसिड. अब इतना लंबा नाम आपने याद नहीं रखना है. द कॉमन नेम इज व्हाट इज डाइकेम्बा. मैं फिर से रिपीट कर देता हूँ, इसका साइंटिफिक नेम क्या है. साइंटिफिक नेम इज दिस इज 2-methoxy 3,6 डाइक्लोरो 3,6 डाइक्लोरोबेंजोइक एसिड. बेंजोइक एसिड. So this is dicamba. ठीक है. This is also a synthetic oxygen. And then we have another one which is very important, which is similar to 2,4-D. जैसे हमने शुरू में बात करी थी ना, पहले हमने क्या देखा था, 2,4-D. 2,4-D. तो अगला वाला क्या है? The next one that we have is 2,4,5-P. This is also a synthetic oxygen. तो पिछला वाला क्या था, 2,4-डाइक्लोरोफेनॉक्सी एसिटिक एसिड. तो ये क्या हो जाएगा, दिस इज this one would be, कहां चला गया, yeah, this is 2,4,5 trichlorophenoxy acetic acid. तो क्या हो जाएगा, this is 2,4,5 trichloro. आप पूरा लिखना, मैंने शॉर्ट फॉर्म डाल दिया. This is 2,4,5 trichlorophenoxy acetic acid. Phenoxy acetic acid. So this is what is 2,4-D. So these are some important oxygens which are found in. Some can be natural, some can be artificial. So we know कि अगर हम ऑक्सीजन की बात करते हैं, when we talk about the oxygen, they show a lot of diversity. They show a lot of diversity. कुछ नेचुरल है, कुछ हमारे सिंथेटिक है. So there's a lot of diversity. Now the question is, even though there's a lot of diversity, जैसे मैंने कहा अमेरिकन, तो आपके मन में आता है भाई गोरे चिट्टे होंगे. मैंने कहा लंदन वाले हैं भाई. लंदन वाले मतलब व्हाट कम्स टू योर माइंड. इफ आई से अफ्रीकन, तो आपके मन में आता है कहीं गोरा. गोरा तो नहीं आता, आपके मन में आता है ही मस्ट बी वेरी ब्लैक. अगर हम कहते हैं एशियंस, दे आर ब्राउन. So same as here, when I'm talking about oxygens, and we know oxygens is a diverse family. Somebody is signed in. Are you able? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Am I
sir.
audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now the question is, see, when I'm talking about oxygen, oxygen कोई एक compound तो नहीं है. There's a family. We know there's a lot of diversity, and it is a family oxygens. Now, do we have some common feature among all these oxygens? जितने सारे oxygens हैं, do we have some common feature between all these diverse oxygens? Do we have some common feature? मैंने कहा अफ्रीकन तो आपको पता कॉमन फीचर है भैया, उनके बाल थोड़े से कर्ली होते हैं, उनका कॉम्प्लेक्शन थोड़ा डार्क होता है, तो कॉमन फीचर दैट दे हैव. सो अमंग दीज ऑक्सीजन, डू वी हैव सम कॉमन फीचर? यस, देयर इज अ कॉमन फीचर, यू नो, अमंग ऑल द ऑक्सीजन, एंड दैट इज, इफ यू लुक एट द स्ट्रक्चर. ये देखो ऑक्सीजन की अगर हम स्ट्रक्चर की बात करें, सो वी नो दिस इज द स्ट्रक्चर. यहाँ पे एक COOH था, H, तो समटाइम्स H तो निकल जाता है, तो we get a negative charge over here. In that case, we'll have a positive charge over here. So in most oxygens, what we see, the aromatic ring has a positive charge, and the COO group, the carboxyl group, it has a negative charge. Okay, this is what we find. Now, what is the common feature? ये तो सभी common feature क्या है? Common feature ये है कि सारे oxygens में जो distance है ये, the negative charge and positive charge के बीच में, this distance, you know, it is something about 0.5 nanometers. So this is a common feature, that the molecular distance of about 0.5 nanometer between the positive charge on the aromatic ring and the negative charge on the carboxylic acid group. This distance is approximately 0.5 nanometer. And that is how we can define different auxins. So this is one common property which is found in all the auxins, that the fractional positive charge on the aromatic ring and the negative charge on the carboxylic acid group, this distance has to be around, there is 0.5 nanometers. Is this very clear? So this is how we define auxins. So we are talking about auxins. Now we know something about the auxins. Now, when we are talking about the auxin, the question comes to your mind. What is the question that comes to my mind? कि भैया इनकी प्रोडक्शन साइट क्या हो? हमें पता है प्लांट्स में होते हैं, they are found in plants. तो where are they produced? Where are the auxins produced in the plants? क्योंकि प्लांट में तो भाई शूट टिप भी है, रूट टिप भी है, लीव्स भी है, फ्रूट्स भी है, सीड्स भी है, जाइलम भी है, फ्लोएम भी है. So which parts of the plant basically produce auxin? So what are the production sites? हमेशा याद रखो कि ऑक्सिन जो है they are normally produced by rapidly dividing tissues. Auxins are normally produced by rapidly dividing tissues. ठीक है? And some of the most common sites, some of the most common site of auxin production in plant. जो common site है, that is everybody knows shoot tip or apical meristem, shoot tip. We call it shoot tip. This is the common site of auxin production. Not only shoot tip, we have another common site of auxin production. And what is that? One of the major sites. Shoot tip is one of the major. This is one of the major. So do we have any other major site of auxin production? और कोई साइट है? Yes, we have. सबके मन में आ रहा है, लेकिन मन कर रहा है मैं बोल दूंगी कहीं गलत ना हो जाए. हमारे मन में कई बार आता है कि हाँ अच्छा ये मैं बोल दूं, लेकिन आपको लग रहा होगा, घबरा रहे हो आप कि कहीं मैं बोल दूं तो गलत ना हो जाए. तो घबराने की कोई बात नहीं है. You can speak freely. तो one of the sites is shoot tip. The second major site आपके बहुतों के मन में आ रहा होगा root tip. Yes, root tip is right answer, but it's not a major site. It's not a major site. One of the major sites of auxin production we know is the young leaves. Young leaves. They also produce a lot of auxin. और आपको पता है, because young leaves produce a lot of auxin and that is why they don't fall. तभी गिरती नहीं है वो. And if they stop producing auxin, the older leaf don't produce auxin and that is why they fall. तो auxin जो क्या करता है? Auxin promotes leaf fall या auxin inhibits leaf fall? बताओ मुझे. और लीफ फॉल को क्या कहते हैं? एब्सेशन. लीफ फॉल बच्चों के लिए कहते हैं हम लीफ फॉल, लेकिन ये ऐसे साइंटिफिकली थोड़ी बोलते हैं. हम साइंटिफिकली कहेंगे हम लीफ एब्सेशन. तो फॉल इज कॉल्ड एज एब्सेशन. तो ऑक्सिन प्रमोट्स लीफ एब्सेशन या ऑक्सिन डिलेज लीफ एब्सेशन? बताओ.
Delay.
ठीक है, क्योंकि यंग लीव्स हैव ऑक्सिन, दे डोंट फॉल, एंड ओल्डर लीव्स don't have oxygen, they don't produce enough oxygen, so they will fall. तो अगर ऑक्सिन है तो लीफ नहीं गिरेगी. नहीं गिरेगी मतलब ऑक्सिन डिलेज leaf abscission. Is this clear? So two major sites of auxin production. We have shoot tip, we have young leaves, but we have other sites also, my friend. ऐसा नहीं कि दो ही sites हैं, we have other sites also. There's another site of auxin production, and that is I've just told you. These are the roots, or I can say root tip. Root tips. They also produce auxin. Root tips also produce auxin, but they are not the major sites. They are not the major sites. आपको पता है कि plants में अगर हम बात करें, if I talk about a plant, if I say this is a plant, sorry, if I say this is a plant, ठीक है, एक plant है ये, तो ये हमारी roots हैं और ये हमारी shoots हैं. तो यहाँ पे भी ऑक्सीजन का प्रोडक्शन हो रहा है और यहाँ पे भी ऑक्सीजन का प्रोडक्शन हो रहा है. ठीक है, लेकिन even though roots produce oxygen, the root tips produce oxygen, they're still dependent on oxygen from the shoots. ये देखो, they're still dependent. भाई आप कमा रहे हो तो जितना कमा लो, लेकिन अगर पापा देंगे तो आप मना नहीं करो. हाँ पापा ही दे दो, मेरे पास तो आएंगे पैसे, भेज दो, मनी ऑर्डर कर दो. तो you are always like roots, and your father is a shoot. तो even though roots are producing auxins, but still they're dependent on shoots for oxygen. And why this is important? Why do roots require extra oxygen from shoots? Then be भाई जब अपना प्रोडक्शन कर रहे हैं तो बाकी की जरूरत क्या है हमें? Why do we still they're dependent on oxygen from the shoots? बोलो.
Excuse me, sir.
आप पापा जी से पैसे ले रहे हो क्योंकि आपको रिबॉक के जूते लेने हैं, आपको आईफोन लेना है, लेकिन रूट्स को थोड़ी लेना है कोई आईफोन. They are producing enough, which is self-sufficient. So why do roots depend on oxygens which are produced from shoots? अरे कुछ तो बोलो, my friends and countrymen.
Sir,
कोई जवाब ही नहीं है. सेल बायो में तो बहुत सारे जवाब आ जाते हैं. प्लांट्स में सबका गोला लगा हुआ है.
excuse me, sir.
Okay, let me tell you. This oxygen which is produced from shoots, and which goes to the roots, this oxygen, this extra oxygen is very important for graviotropism. Let me tell you, this is important for graviotropism. Or sometimes we call it geotropism. Why roots always move towards gravity? And shoots, we know they move away from the gravity. They move away from gravity. Roots we know are positively geotropic. We call them as positively geotropic. Shoots we call them as negatively geotropic. Why? Who's controlling all this? Who controls this gravity in the plant? The sensation towards gravity. This is also one of the functions of oxygens. Oxygens are also involved in graviotropism. So oxygens have a very important role. Is it clear? भाई बात समझ में आ गई कि नहीं आ गई?
Yes, sir.
अरे अब तो बोल दो.
Yes, sir.
मेरी आवाज ही नहीं आ रही हो. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Just hold on. Somebody has raised the hand. Are Bharat,
Sir,
am I audible?
Yes, sir. You are audible, sir. You can't
Hello.
You can't listen us, sir.
Just a minute. Am I audible?
Yes,
Sir,
sir.
you
You
are
are
audible.
audible.
Oh, my mic.
Sir, I think we are not audible to you.
Hello. Am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. You are audible.
Hello. Very good. Very good.
Sir, but we were you were not listening us, sir.
आपको मेरी
So
आवाज
we
आ रही
were
है?
also speaking.
अच्छा अच्छा चलो वो कोई बात नहीं. So the question is कहाँ से आपको आवाज समझ में नहीं आई बताओ मुझे.
So
So you were audible, properly audible.
अच्छा अच्छा मुझे आपकी आवाज नहीं आ रही. चलो कोई बात नहीं. See now the question is कि you have understood, okay? कि what is the role of basically oxygens? Oxygens are basically involved in the sensation towards gravity. This is also controlled by oxygens. Now when I say positively geotropic, when I say negatively geotropic, I am using a term called as tropism. Geotropism. What is tropism? What is tropic? Tropic are movements. So we have in plants, we talk about movements which are tropic movements. So there are tropic movements. For example, I say, okay, we have phototropic movement. We know the shoot tip hai, the shoot tip moves towards light. We know shoot tip moves kahan bend karegi, yahan bend karegi. ऐसा थोड़ी कि डार्क की तरफ बेंड करेगी. It will bend towards light. If you keep a plant on your window, तो प्लांट क्या विंडो के बाहर जाता है, विंडो के अंदर आ जाएगा जहां अंधेरा है. It will move towards light. So this is what? This is phototropic movements. We know roots will move towards gravity. So we call it graviotropic movements.
Certain plants, they respond to touch. This is called as thigmotropic. Thigmotropic movement. So what is tropic? What is the tropic movement? आपने याद रखना है, tropic movements are those movements which are towards the stimulus. So movement towards the stimulus is called as what? This is called as a tropic movement. This is what is called as a tropic movement towards the stimulus. Okay? So we're not looking at all these in detail. I was just talking about what? I was just talking about what is the role of the auxins? We're talking about the production. In fact, we're talking about the production sites of auxin. So I told you one of the major site of auxin production is we have seen this shoot tip, we have the young leaves, and also roots also produce auxin, but still they're dependent on shoots for the auxin. Not only this, we also have seeds. Seeds are also rich in auxin. And fruits, they also contain large amount of auxin. So all these parts of the plant, they contain abundant auxin. So this is also very clear. कि auxin kahan banta hai, where it is synthesized. Now the question is, when we are talking about the synthesis of auxin, अगर हम auxin की synthesis की बात करें, तो I can ask you कि what is the precursor for auxin synthesis? एक क्वेश्चन पूछा हुआ था. What is the precursor for auxin synthesis? क्या precursor है भाई auxin synthesis का? We know, very simple. The precursor for the auxin synthesis is mainly tryptophan, which is an amino acid. We know it is an amino acid, tryptophan. So this is the precursor for the synthesis of auxin. अब एक बार एक एग्जामिनर ने बड़ा स्मार्ट ऑप्शन दे रखा था, एक क्वेश्चन में एक ऑप्शन दे रखा था, and that option was we had indole 3 glycerol phosphate. एक ऑप्शन दे रखा था एक क्वेश्चन में, indole 3 glycerol phosphate. ठीक है, वहां पे tryptophan नहीं था. In that question, tryptophan option was not given, and they were asking, okay, which is the precursor for the auxin synthesis? Most of the students thought कि भैया तो क्वेश्चन ही गलत है, क्योंकि सबको ये पता है कि tryptophan is the precursor. अब वहां tryptophan तो ऑप्शन ही नहीं था वहां पे. The examiner is very smart. One of the options that was given over there was indole 3 glycerol phosphate, and we know indole 3 glycerol phosphate, this is the precursor for synthesis of tryptophan. तो मतलब ये भी सही है. एग्जामिनर आपको कहीं से भी पकड़ सकता है. उसने ये नहीं दिया, उसने ये दे दिया. तो indole 3 glycerol phosphate, we know this is the precursor for the synthesis of tryptophan. मतलब ये भी सही है और ये भी सही है, दोनों ही है. तो remember both. Tryptophan, that is very common, everybody knows, and indole 3 glycerol phosphate, this many students do not know, but this is also the precursor for. ठीक है. Now the question is, ये जो synthesis है, जो हम जो इसकी ऑक्सिन सिंथेसिस की बात कर रहे हैं, ऑक्सिन सिंथेसिस mainly takes place in the chloroplast. So what is the site of synthesis? That is mainly chloroplast. This is the mainly site of synthesis. क्योंकि जो tryptophan है, tryptophan is produced through a pathway which is called as shikmic acid pathway. This is the pathway which is not found in animals. Animals में नहीं मिलता. Animals में you don't get this pathway. Plants have this pathway, shikmic acid pathway, and that is why हम amino acids कहते हैं ना, essential amino acids, non-essential amino acids. क्यों भाई? Essential amino acids कौन से हो गए? जो आप नहीं synthesize कर सकते वो essential हो गए. Is this very clear? तो we have essential and non-essential amino acids. जो हमारे पास नहीं होता है वो एसेंशियल हो जाता है. मेरे पापा के पास गाड़ी नहीं थी तो मेरे लिए एसेंशियल हो गई. आज पापा के पास गाड़ी है तो एसेंशियल नहीं है. So that is why the certain amino acids which cannot be synthesized by animals. क्यों? Why animals are not able to synthesize certain amino acids? Because they do not have shikimic acid pathway. So this is the pathway which is found in plants. This is the pathway which is found in bacteria. This is the pathway which is found in fungi. They all have shikimic acid pathway. Plants, bacteria, fungi, they all have shikimic acid pathway. Like in animals, we don't have this shikimic acid pathway. And that is why animals cannot synthesize certain amino acids. और ये जो shikimic acid pathway है, this is used for synthesis of some important amino acid, for example, phenylalanine. We have tryptophan. We have tyrosine. These are some of the essential amino acids which can be only synthesized by plants. So ultimately, we know this pathway is found in chloroplast. So tryptophan synthesis will mainly take in chloroplast. And tryptophan, we know, is the precursor for the synthesis of auxin. And that is why we say that synthesis of auxin basically takes place in the chloroplast. Okay? So this is also very, very clear. Now, when we talk about auxins, a plant है, plant में तो बहुत सारा auxin है. So do you think all the auxin is in the active form? A plant में हमारा बहुत सारा auxin पड़ा हुआ है. Do you think most of the auxin which is found in plant is active? No. We know a large amount of auxin which is found in plants is present in inactive form. A large amount of auxin which is found in plants is basically found in inactive form. And what do we call this as? This is called as the conjugated form of auxin. This is called as the conjugated form of auxin, which is the inactive form of the auxin. Okay, and we know this is hormonally inactive. This form is hormonally inactive. So what's the conjugated? When I say conjugated, by शादी के बाद आप conjugated हो जाते हो. You are attached to somebody. मम्मी ने आपको conjugate कर दिया, चल अब तू बदमाश हो गया, तेरी शादी कर देते हैं. You are conjugated now. तो conjugated form of auxin मतलब क्या? कि auxin is attached to a molecule. Auxin is attached to some molecule. It is conjugated. ठीक है? And for example, ये जो conjugated, some of the examples of the conjugated form. Let us see some examples. जैसे देखते हैं, in plants we have esters of IAA along with methyl group, Now this is a conjugated form of auxin. Esters of IA along with methyl group. So this is a conjugated form and this is inactive form of auxin. Similarly, we have esters of IAA along with glucose. This is also a conjugated form of auxin, which is also inactive. Similarly, we have compounds which are called as IAA glucans. This is also conjugated form of auxin. Similarly, we have another compound which is called as, we have IAA peptides. Similarly, we have IAA glycoproteins. क्या ये सारे? All these are what? IA glucans, IA peptides, IA glycoproteins. We have esters of IA along with methyl group, along with glucose. All these are the inactive form of auxins. All these are the conjugated form of auxins. Is this very clear? And sometimes we say कि ये जो conjugated form है, they function as the reversible storage forms. मैं क्या कह रहा हूँ? ये जो conjugated form है, it functions as what? It functions as reversible storage form. भाई जब जरूरत नहीं है तो conjugate करके उनको store कर दो. जब जरूरत है तो इनको unconjugate कर दो, they become active. So that means a large amount of auxin can be stored. It is not always active. You can store it in the plants in the form of conjugated form, which is inactive. And most of this conjugated form is mainly found in the seeds. Seeds, we know, are very rich in the conjugated form of auxins. Am I clear with this? So just keep in mind, कि all the oxygen found in plant is never in the active form. जितनी जरूरत है उतना एक्टिव करेंगे, जितना नहीं है उसको कॉन्जुगेट करके रख देंगे. Cotyledons, जो cotyledons हैं सीड में, they are also rich in the conjugated form, you know. Is this clear? और एक चीज और याद रखनी है, I told you, indole acetic acid is one of the most common auxins which is found in the plants. It is a naturally occurring auxin, indole acetic acid. We know in plants, ये जो IBA है, indole butyric acid, this is also natural, this is also natural. But in plants, we know IBA can be converted to IAA. ये जो IBA है, we know enzymatically this can be converted to indole acetic acid, especially in peroxisomes. Peroxisomes में IBA can be converted to IAA. तो peroxisome has a very important function. ये भी याद रखो कि peroxisome का function है कि in plants it can convert IBA to IA. अब ये तो किसी को पता ही नहीं होता. And let me tell you, जब हम बीटा ऑक्सीडेशन की बात करते हैं, when we talk about बीटा ऑक्सीडेशन मतलब फैट का ब्रेकडाउन, जो फैटी एसिड्स का ब्रेकडाउन होता है, that is via बीटा ऑक्सीडेशन. And if I ask any student कि where beta oxidation takes place, we know 99% students would say कि sir it takes place in mitochondria. आप भी ये बोलने वाले थे ना? बताओ मुझे, बीटा ऑक्सीडेशन कहाँ होती है? बोलो. लगता है फिर मेरी आवाज नहीं आ रही क्या?
Sir, in plants, in mitochondria and peroxisomes both.
है ना? So we know 99% students would say mitochondria, but we know in the case of plants, it's mainly the peroxisomes. You know, it can also take place in peroxisomes. Peroxisomes में beta oxidation can take place. So peroxisomes are very important. You know, और हमें पता है कि animals में normally ये जो peroxisomes, जो glyoxysomes, they are found more in the case of plants. Plants में ज़्यादा abundant है. जैसे glyoxysomes होते हैं, वो तो animals में मिलते ही नहीं है. Glyoxysomes are not found in animals; they are mainly found in plants only. So they are more abundant in the case of plants. ठीक है? Now, so let us not deviate. My point was, I was telling you कि plants में IBA can be converted to IAA, especially in the peroxisomes. ठीक है? I'm talking about auxins. I'm talking about auxins. अब ये प्लांट की सेल है. चलो, ये सेल है हमारी प्लांट की. ये हमारा न्यूक्लियस है. ये हमारा क्लोरोप्लास्ट है. क्योंकि यहाँ पे, and this is the mitochondria that we have. देखने से पता लग जाता है कि माइटोकॉन्ड्रिया ये हमारा क्लोरोप्लास्ट है. This is mitochondria. This is nucleus. और ये हमारा साइटोसॉल है. ये सारा साइटोसॉल है. Where is auxin? ऑक्सिन कहाँ है? बोलो. प्लांट में ऑक्सिन कहाँ है? भाई सेल के अंदर ही तो होगा कि सेल के बाहर घूम रहा है? Where is oxygen inside the cell?
Sir, in the chloroplast.
वहां तो बन रहा है. आपको पता है जो ऑक्सिजन होता है, ऑक्सिजन क्या है? सिग्नल है ना?
Yes, sir.
ऑक्सिजन इज अ सिग्नल. तो सिग्नल का क्या काम होता है? रिसेप्टर से बाइंड करना.
Yes, sir.
तभी तो क्या हो जाएगा? जीन एक्सप्रेशन होगा. तो ऑक्सिजन इज अ सिग्नल. ऑक्सिजन क्या करेगा? ऑक्सिजन विल गो एंड बाइंड टू रिसेप्टर. तो वेयर आर द रिसेप्टर्स फॉर ऑक्सिजन?
न्यूक्लियस सर.
तो फिर ऑक्सिजन कहाँ है? ऑक्सिजन के रिसेप्टर्स हमें पता है न्यूक्लियस में होते हैं. ऑक्सिजन का प्रोडक्शन यहाँ पे हो रहा है. आपको पता है, लेट मी टेल यू, इफ यू लुक एट अ प्लांट सेल, वी सी कि ऑक्सिजन is partitioned between two compartments. The presence of oxygen is partitioned between two compartments. आपको पता है जो क्लोरोप्लास्ट है, क्लोरोप्लास्ट only has 33% oxygen. The remaining कितना बचा? 67%. The remaining 67% oxygen, this is found in cytosol. This is found in cytosol. ठीक है? So when I look at oxygen, we see in the plants there's also compartmentalization of the oxygen. It shows compartmentalization. ठीक है? तो ये बात हमारी क्लियर होगी. Now this is very very clear. तो चलो हम ऑक्सीजन की बात करते हैं. टॉकिंग अबाउट ऑक्सीजन, कहीं भूल जाओ आप. ये हमारा ऑक्सीजन का प्रोडक्शन हो रहा है प्लांट में. ये हमारा प्लांट है, ये हमारे रूट्स हैं, ये हमारा शूट है. तो व्हेन आई एम टॉकिंग अबाउट ऑक्सीजन, हमें पता है ऑक्सीजन इज मेनली प्रोड्यूस्ड इन द शूट टिप. वन ऑफ द मेन साइट्स ऑफ ऑक्सीजन प्रोडक्शन इन द इज द शूट टिप. तो व्हेन द ऑक्सीजन इज प्रोड्यूस्ड इन द शूट टिप, व्हाट विल हैपन टू दिस ऑक्सीजन? दिस ऑक्सीजन इज ट्रांसपोर्टेड. भाई ट्रांसपोर्ट होगा इसका. We know this oxygen produced in the shoot tip is transported downwards. It is transported downwards towards the base of the shoot. भाई ये हमारा shoot है. And then we have the root. So oxygen which is produced in the shoot tip is first transported downwards towards the shoot, base of the shoot, and then from base of the shoot, it is transported towards the tip of the root. Tip of the root. Look at the oxygen transport. And we know this oxygen transport from tip of the shoot towards the base of the shoot, tip to base. Tip to base. This is called as what? This is called as basipetal. This is called as basipetal transport of oxygen from tip to base of the shoot, and then from the base of the root to tip of the root. ये देखो अब ये कहां जा रहा है? From base of shoot it is moving towards tip of the root. This is called as what is acropetal transport. So no confusion. We have basipetal transport in the shoots. और roots में कौन सा transport है? Acropetal. Acropetal मतलब towards the tip. When I say acropetal, what do you mean by acropetal? Acropetal means towards tip. And basipetal away from the tip. तो जो ऑक्सीजन का ट्रांसपोर्ट है शूट्स के केस में वी कॉल इट बेसिपेटल, रूट्स के केस में वी कॉल इट एक्रोपेटल. नाउ दिस इज अ वेरी सिंपल पिक्चर, लेकिन मेरा काम है, मेरी आदत है, मैं इसको कॉम्प्लेक्स कर देता हूं. अभी बहुत सिंपल है ये, बट ऑक्सीजन ट्रांसपोर्ट इनफैक्ट इज मोर कॉम्प्लिकेटेड. इतना आसान थोड़ी है. इतना ही आसान होता तो आपको पता नहीं होता. वी नो ऑक्सीजन ट्रांसपोर्ट इज मच मोर कॉम्प्लिकेटेड. यू नो रूट्स के केस में वी कैन ऑल्सो हैव बेसिपेटल ट्रांसपोर्ट. रूट्स में लुक एट रूट्स, व्हाट यू सीन. रूट्स में ये रूट टिप है, ठीक है. यहाँ पे ऑक्सीजन आया, शूट से आया, और यहाँ पे खुद भी प्रोड्यूस हो रहा है ऑक्सीजन. ऑक्सीजन इज बीइंग प्रोड्यूस्ड हियर आल्सो. एंड फ्रॉम रूट टिप वी नो द ऑक्सीजन कैन आल्सो ट्रेवल बैकवर्ड्स. ये देखो, फ्रॉम रूट टिप the oxygen can also travel backwards towards the cortical area and towards the outer epidermal area. मतलब root tip से oxygen can move backwards towards the cortical cells as well as towards the epidermal cells. Now this is what? This is basipetal. कोई confusion? क्योंकि it is moving away from the tip. तो roots में we have both. We have acropetal transport and we have the basipetal transport in the roots. Now ये जो basipetal transport है, this basipetal transport in the roots, this is the one which is important for graviotropism. This is the one involved in sensing gravity. This is the one which is involved in graviotropism. This basipetal transport. ठीक है? So let us not make it more complex. And let me tell you, ये देखो, let me try it again. तो ऑक्सीजन का मूवमेंट, मेनली ये मूवमेंट ऑक्सीजन का, दिस इज द मेन मूवमेंट ऑफ ऑक्सीजन. This is the main movement of the oxygen. Now this, you can see here, ये जो oxygen, it is moving unidirectional. This movement of oxygen is basically unidirectional. This is the unidirectional. Very important here. This is the unidirectional movement of oxygen. ठीक है, आपने याद रखना है, this unidirectional movement from one area to another area, sometimes we call it the polar transport. Sometimes we call it polar transport of oxygen. We call it the polar transport of oxygen. Now, why this is important? The question is why this is important. यहां से प्रोड्यूस हो रहा है, यहां की तरफ बढ़ रहा है, देखो यहां जा रहा है, ऊपर से नीचे आ रहा है ऑक्सीजन. This is the unidirectional, and this is called as the polar transport of oxygen. Why this is important? आपको याद होना चाहिए, आपको पता होना चाहिए कि oxygen is the only hormone which shows polar transport. याद रखो, oxygen is the only hormone. This is the only hormone which shows what? Polar transport or unidirectional transport. बात समझ में आ गई? ठीक है, अब देखो भाई, मेन प्रोडक्शन यहाँ पे हो रहा है, यहाँ पे कम प्रोडक्शन है. मेन प्रोडक्शन इन दी शूट एपेक्स, शूट टिप. दैट मीन्स व्हेन ऑक्सीजन, भाई आप, पापा जी आपको पैसा देते हैं, तो पापा जी के पास ज्यादा पैसा है तभी तो आपको दे रहे हैं. पापा जी इज मोर मनी, आपके पास पैसा कम है तो पापा जी गिव्स यू मनी. तो सेम इज हियर. When this oxygen moves from shoot tip to root tip, there is a gradient of oxygen which is maintained in the plant. यहाँ ज्यादा ऑक्सीजन होगा, फिर आते आते और कम हो जाएगा, फिर और कम हो जाएगा. That means there's more oxygen in the upper side, less oxygen on the lower side. So because of this polar transport of oxygen, there's a gradient which is maintained. There's a gradient of oxygen which is maintained in the plant. Vertically, there's a gradient of oxygen which is maintained, and this gradient of oxygen in the plant also plays a very important role. ये जो gradient है, this gradient also plays a very important role. We know this gradient basically affects various developmental processes in the plant. It affects various developmental processes in the plant. जैसे बड़ा कॉमन है, एक कॉमन एग्जांपल दे रहा हूं, एपिकल डोमिनेंस. We have apical dominance, and we know who is responsible for apical dominance. It is auxins. Why? There's a gradient of oxygen, so this is responsible for apical dominance. We know this is also responsible for stem elongation. This is also responsible for leaf abscission or leaf senescence. In fact, this is also responsible for, we have the embryonic development. In fact, wound healing in plants. So various developmental processes are affected by this gradient of oxygens which are present in the plants. Is this clear? Now the question is,
Excuse me, sir.
yeah,
Sir, can you show the last slide?
see this apical dominance, stem elongation, leaf. ना याद नहीं रखना है आपको, मैं हर चीज बोल रहा हूँ, इतना जरूरी नहीं है कि आपको हर चीज याद ही रखनी है. You will get burdened. सिर्फ ये याद रख लो बस, इतने याद रख लो बस, बहुत है. Apical dominance, stem elongation, leaf senescence, बस ये छोड़ दो.
Okay, sir.
Now I am telling you कि oxygen shows polar transport. There's a unidirectional transport of oxygen in the plant. ठीक है, and ये जो, अब एक चीज बताओ मुझे, एक बच्चा है, कोई भी बच्चा हो सकता है, मैं कहूंगी भैया प्लांट में ये देखो, ये यूनिडायरेक्शनल पोलर ट्रांसपोर्ट हो रहा है ऑक्सीजन का. दिस इज द पोलर ट्रांसपोर्ट. ठीक है, यहाँ पे ज्यादा है, यहाँ पे कम है, तो इट इज अ पोलर ट्रांसपोर्ट. नाउ द क्वेश्चन इज, डू यू थिंक दिस पोलर ट्रांसपोर्ट ऑफ ऑक्सीजन इज इफेक्टेड बाय ग्रेविटी? ये हमारा सॉइल है, वी नो दिस इज द सॉइल, और यहां से ग्रेविटी आ रही है नीचे से, दिस इज द ग्रेविटी. सो इफ आई से कि पोलर ट्रांसपोर्ट of oxygen is affected by gravity, अगर मैं चॉइस दे दूं आपको, चलो पोलर ट्रांसपोर्ट इज अफेक्टेड बाय ग्रेविटी, एक ऑप्शन आ गया एग्जाम में, तो मेरा आंसर क्या होगा? टेल मी व्हाट वुड बी माय आंसर, बताओ। बोलो।
So maybe yes, it's affected by gravity.
हमेशा याद रखो जो आप आंसर देते हो मोस्टली उल्टे होंगे।
So it's not affected by gravity.
बिल्कुल सही आंसर। मेरे लेक्चर्स में जो आपके मन में आ रहा है ना, जो आपके मन में भाव आ रहे हैं उससे उल्टे होते हैं बस। अगर आपको लग रहा है कि इफेक्टेड होगा तो मतलब नहीं इफेक्टेड है। देखो कितना कंफ्यूजन है, देखो है ना। सो वी नो पोलर ट्रांसपोर्ट ऑफ ऑक्सीजन इज नॉट इफेक्टेड बाय ग्रेविटी। याद रखो ये। कहने का मतलब ये कि अगर मैं इसको इन्वर्ट कर दूं, अगर मैं उल्टा कर दूं, चलो अगर मैं इसको उल्टा कर दूं, ये रूट्स हैं, ये शूट्स हैं, मैंने एक बीकर में इसको ऐसे रख दिया, यहाँ पे न्यूट्रिएंट मीडियम है, तो आपको क्या लगता है कि रूट्स चेंज हो जाएगा? इफ पोलर ट्रांसपोर्ट हैड बीन इफेक्टेड बाय ग्रेविटी, फिर तो मैं अगर इसको उल्टा कर दूंगा, if I keep it in opposite orientation, so in that case it will be disturbed. तो शूट हमेशा यही रहेगी और रूट्स हमेशा यही रहेंगे। Even if you change the orientation of the plant, still roots will always grow at the same place, shoot will always grow at the same tip. So gravity will never affect the unipolar transport of oxygens in the plants. Am I clear with this? ठीक है, तो चलो एक चीज और देखते हैं। अब मैं आपसे इतनी देर से कह रहा हूं, I've been telling you, I've been shouting from so long कि oxygen is transported unidirectionally, polar transport of oxygen from top to bottom. But the question is, when I'm talking about the polar transport, if I talk about the polar transport of oxygen, ये हमारी शूट है, ये हमारी रूट है, ये हमारा ऑक्सीजन का ट्रांसपोर्ट हो रहा है, यहाँ पे घूमते घूमते आ रहा है, देखो थोड़ा सा घूम गया। Now this is what the question is, ये जो ट्रांसपोर्ट है क्या हवा में हो रहा है क्या? Is it taking place in the air? Which cells are involved in the polar transport of oxygen? I am more smart than you. Transport of oxygen. बताओ किन सेल्स के थ्रू हो रहा है? Which cells are involved in the polar transport of oxygen? अगर मैं टीएस काटूं, यहाँ से सेक्शन काटूं, आपको सबको पता है ना सेक्शन, यहाँ पे देखो जाइलम वी हैव, यहाँ बीच में कैम्बियम भी आ जाता है, यहाँ फ्लोएम आ जाता है, यहाँ पे वी हैव द पेरिसाइकिल, यहाँ पे फिर एंडोडर्मिस आ जाता है प्लांट्स में, यहाँ पे इनर कॉर्टेक्स, फिर यहाँ पे आउटर कॉर्टेक्स, ऑल दैट स्टफ, फिर यहाँ पे एपिडर्मिस आ जाता है। दीज आर द मेन टिश्यूज व्हिच आर प्रेजेंट। इनमें से तो कोई होगा व्हिच इज इन्वॉल्वड, ये सारी सारी इन्वॉल्वड है। अगर शूट टिप से ऑक्सीजन नीचे जा रहा है तो किसके थ्रू जा रहा है मेरे भाई? बीच में मैं भूल गया, पित भी होती है यहाँ पे, कई प्लांट्स में आप देखो पित भी है, पित होती है, फिर सराउंडिंग दिस इज फ्लोएम, फिर सराउंडिंग दैट इज जाइलम, और जाइलम और फ्लोएम के बीच में कैम्बियम होता है यहाँ पे। तो अलग अलग प्लांट्स में अलग अलग ओरिएंटेशन है। ऐसा भी होता है कुछ प्लांट्स में कि बीच में वी हैव दिस सेंट्रल पित। तो क्या पित के थ्रू ट्रांसफर हो रहा है क्या? टेल मी। Let me tell you what we have found. It is mainly the xylem which is involved. Mainly xylem. अब जो बॉटनी वाले बच्चे हैं उनका तो दिमाग घूम जाएगा। आप कहोगे सर जाइलम तो पानी ट्रांसपोर्ट करता है नीचे से ऊपर। हमने देखा है ना प्लांट्स में, जब हम प्लांट्स की बात करते हैं तो जाइलम क्या करता है? जाइलम ट्रांसपोर्ट्स वाटर फ्रॉम सॉइल टू टॉप। ये तो काम है ना जाइलम का। to uplift water through transpirational pull. और मैं कह रहा हूं कि भाई जाइलम में जब पानी ऊपर जा रहा है तो जाइलम से फिर ऑक्सीजन नीचे कैसे आ जाएगा? Tell me how xylem can conduct oxygen when water is moving upwards and it is being driven by the transpirational pull. तो आपको क्या लगता है कि जाइलम में सिर्फ फ्रैकीड्स और वेसल्स ही होते हैं क्या? भाई जाइलम में भी have other cells also. If you look at the xylem, in xylem we have something called as xylem parenchyma cells. Part of the xylem tissue is a cell called as xylem parenchyma cells. जैसे फ्लोएम की बात करें, फ्लोएम में सीव सेल्स होते हैं, सीव ट्यूब्स होते हैं, कंपेनियन सेल्स होते हैं, और वहां पे फ्लोएम पैरेन्काइमा सेल्स भी होते हैं. तो xylem doesn't only means vessels and tracheids. So what research has shown, what recent research has shown, it is the xylem parenchyma cells which are involved. It is mainly the xylem parenchyma cells which are involved in the polar transport of oxygen, बात समझ में आ गई?
Yes, sir.
तो आपको क्या लगता है, ट्रांसपोर्ट इतना आसान है? ट्रांसपोर्ट इतना आसान है? लुक एट, आई टोल्ड यू मोस्ट अबंडेंट ऑक्सीजन IAA, इंडोल एसिटिक एसिड, एसिड है भाई, मतलब COOH ग्रुप है ना इसमें, एसिड है, COH ग्रुप होगा. मैंने बताया भी था कि व्हाट आर ऑक्सीजन्स which have a aromatic ring and a carboxylic acid group, they have a carboxylic acid group. तो मतलब ये जो IAA, it can also exist as IAAH and it can also exist as IAA negative. जब यहां से H निकल गया it will become negative. तो जो ऑक्सीजन है, one of the main oxygens which is found in plant, indole acetic acid, it can exist in the plant in two forms. This is the protonated form. This is the protonated form of oxygen. And this is what? This is the non-protonated form. Non-protonated form, where it is existing as an anion. यहाँ पे anion है और यहाँ पे एक molecule है, where it has no charge. So oxygen in the plant, which is the main oxygen IAA, can exist in two forms. One is the protonated form, IAH, there's no charge, and one is the negative charge, that is, it is an anion. Am I clear? And ये जो oxygen है, आपने याद रखना है, oxygen, this oxygen mainly shows, अगर मैंने कहा कि ट्रांसपोर्ट हो रहा है, किसके थ्रू हो रहा है? जाइलम पैरेन्काइमा सेल्स के थ्रू. मतलब एक जाइलम पैरेन्काइमा सेल ये है, एक 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 ये है, ये हमारी रूट्स आ गई, हमारा शूट्स में है. तो यही तो ट्रांसपोर्ट हो रहा है. दिस इज हाउ द ऑक्सीजन इज बीइंग ट्रांसपोर्टेड. दिस इज हाउ द ऑक्सीजन इज बीइंग ट्रांसपोर्टेड. दैट मींस ये जो ऑक्सीजन ट्रांसपोर्ट है, इवन दो इट इज ट्रांसपोर्टेड वाया जाइलम पैरेन्काइमा सेल, but oxygen shows cell to cell transport. Always keep in mind, it shows cell to cell transport. And that is how it reaches the roots, through cell to cell transport. एक सेल से दूसरे सेल, दूसरे से तीसरे सेल. Am I clear? मतलब कहने का ये, if I take two cells, चलो दो सेल ले लेते हैं यहाँ पे. ये एक सेल हो गई. When I talk about a cell, there's also a cell wall. There's a cell wall that we have. ठीक है. This is the membrane. अंदर में हमारी membrane है यहाँ पे, ये देखो. This is the membrane that we have. Similarly, तो ये हमारी membrane है और बाहर हमारा cell wall है. चलो एक और सेल बना लेते हैं. We make another cell. ठीक है, ये हमारी cell wall है और अंदर में क्या है हमारा? प्लाज्मा membrane है. ये प्लाज्मा membrane है हमारी. And we know the problem with the plasma membrane. Plasma membrane has a problem. And the problem with the plasma membrane is what? The problem with the plasma membrane is that plasma membrane is rich in lipids. This is rich in lipids. जो cell wall है, ये जो हमारा cell wall region है, we know cell wall region is porous. ये region porous होता है. cellulose fibers, we have pectin, we have lignin. So there's a lot of porosity which is maintained. And at the same time, जो cell wall region है हमारा, ये जो cell wall, this is cell wall. Cell wall is regarded as the dead region of the plant. Keep in mind, this is regarded as the dead region. This is regarded as the dead region of the plant. And we call it what? We call it apoplast. Apoplast. तो जब हम प्लांट्स की बात करते हैं, we use commonly two terms. हम दो terms की यूज करते हैं, apoplast and we use symplast. So whenever I use this term apoplast, मतलब this is the dead region. मतलब intercellular spaces, we have the cell wall. This is all part of the apoplast. And when I say symplast, मतलब the living cytoplasm, membrane, this is the symplast region. Am I clear with this? तो किसी भी चीज की हम ट्रांसपोर्ट की बात करते हैं प्लांट्स में, we'll always use apoplast, symplast. जब वाटर मूवमेंट की बात करते हो तो apoplast region, it enters inside the cell, symplast region. So always remember these two terms. ठीक है? Now the question is, see, now if we talk about, चलो बात करते हैं ऑक्सीजन ट्रांसपोर्ट. Let us talk about oxygen transport. Just hold on. भाई ऑक्सीजन साइटोप्लाज्म में पड़ा हुआ है. I told you कि 75% ऑक्सीजन कहाँ है? मैंने बताया था ना कि presence of oxygen is compartmentalized in the cell. 75% oxygen is found in cytoplasm. तो ऑक्सीजन का ट्रांसपोर्ट कैसे होगा? भाई आपको पापा पैसे देंगे तो पहले पापा देंगे तभी तो आप लोगे. मतलब there's a efflux and then there's a influx. तो सबसे पहले क्या होगा? सबसे पहले ऑक्सीजन has to move out from a cell. और देखो कंफ्यूजन, और if I create more confusion, बीच में हमारा मिडिल लैमेला भी है. We have middle lamella in plants. We know which is made up of calcium pactate. मिडिल लैमेला भी क्रॉस करना पड़ेगा ना मेरे भाई. कितने मजे की बात है. तो चलो करते हैं. पहले ऑक्सीजन को बाहर आना पड़ेगा. It has to come out. मतलब this is called as what is efflux. And then oxygen has to enter. भाई इसके सेल वॉल में आ गया, सेकंड सेल के सेल वॉल में आ गया. देन इट हैज टू क्रॉस द प्लाज्मा मेम्ब्रेन टू एंटर अनदर सेल. प्लाज्मा मेम्ब्रेन को क्रॉस करना पड़ेगा तभी दूसरी सेल में एंट्री मारेगा. सो दिस इज कॉल्ड एज व्हाट इज इनफ्लक्स. इफ्लक्स, इनफ्लक्स. दैट मींस जो ऑक्सीजन का मूवमेंट है, जो ऑक्सीजन का ट्रांसपोर्ट है, इट बेसिकली combines two movements. It involves two different kinds of movements, efflux and influx. Efflux and influx. Am I clear? कितनी बात समझ में आ गई?
Yes, sir.
Anybody who has not understood? तो चलो पहले हम बात करते हैं influx की. Then we'll talk about efflux. Let us first talk about influx of oxygen. Is this clear? तो when I draw a cell, चलो मैं एक सेल बनाता हूं फिर से. I draw a plant cell. Just hold on. ये हमारी प्लांट सेल है. I am drawing a plant cell. ठीक है. और थोड़ा सा गड़बड़ हो जाता है डायग्राम. Just hold on. So this is a okay, good enough. This is the plant cell. This is the cell wall that we have. This is the cell wall and this is the membrane. ये हमारी membrane है. And we know membrane is hydrophobic, rich in lipids, hydrophobic. तो चलो we are talking about influx, मतलब ऑक्सीजन आ चुका है. अब इसके अंदर influx होना है तो ऑक्सीजन अभी cell wall, this is the cell wall region and this is the plasma membrane, which is rich in lipids. And we know plasma membrane is very impermeable. It is not easily permeable. It is a barrier for movement of ions. Ions movement के लिए ये barrier है. क्योंकि ये lipids है, lipids के through ion पानी तो पास नहीं करेगा. Ions cannot pass. So most of the oxygen has come and oxygen is present in the cell wall. Oxygen यहाँ पे पड़ा हुआ है. IAA is found in the, everything is present in the cell wall region. Now the problem with the cell wall is, if you look at the problem with the cell wall, we know cell wall is acidic in nature. You know what is the pH of cell wall? the pH of cell wall is approximately 5.5. This is the pH of cell wall. मतलब cell wall is slightly acidic. Whereas हम cytosol की बात करें, if we talk about cytoplasm, we know cytosol is slightly alkaline, 7.2 to 7.3. So this is alkaline. This is acidic. मतलब cell wall region has more protons. Cell wall में हमारे ज्यादा protons हैं क्योंकि acidic है. और cytoplasm में protons कम है. Less protons in the cytoplasm. So that means I can say what? Ki across the plasma membrane, there's a proton gradient which is maintained. Across the plasma membrane, there's what? There's a proton gradient which is maintained. Am I clear? किसी को कोई confusion? Any confusion? भाई हम ऑक्सीजन पढ़ रहे हैं, मत भूल जाना. कई बार बच्चे बीच में भूल भी जाते हैं. So that means across the plasma membrane, there's a proton gradient which is maintained. Outside, there are more protons. Inside, there are less protons. Now, if somebody is very smart out of you, you'll ask me, sir, how this gradient is maintained? Why cell wall is more acidic? You tell me the answer. Why cell wall is acidic? बोलो भाई. भाई प्लांट से कौन है यहाँ पे? Anybody
No,
from the
I
plants?
cannot.
Yes, sir.
So
Sir,
let
to
me
make a proton gradient, sir.
देखो, हमने क्या देखा है कि जो प्लांट के प्लाज्मा मेम्ब्रेन्स हैं, प्लांट प्लाज्मा मेम्ब्रेन्स है प्रोटीन्स, एक्टिव ट्रांसपोर्टर्स. यहाँ पे एक्टिव ट्रांसपोर्टर्स हैं. एंड व्हाट डू वी कॉल देम एज? वी कॉल देम एज H positive ATPase. The plasma membrane of plants have H positive ATPases. And what they do is they keep pumping out H ions. They pump H ions outside. They pump H ions outside and they use energy from the ATP hydrolysis. ATP is converted to ADP. ATP is converted to ADP. So plant plasma membranes have H positive ATPases. And these are the ones which are responsible for maintaining this proton gradient. याद रखो, they are ones responsible for maintaining the proton gradient. और ये जो H positive ATPases हैं, मैं आपको ये भी बता दूं कि they belong to a class of proteins. They belong to a class of proteins. We call them as P-type ATPases. We call them as P-type ATPase. Is this clear? So we call them as P-type ATPase. Am I clear with this? Okay. So it is the P-type ATPases which are involved in maintaining a proton gradient across the plasma membrane. And that is why the cell wall becomes acidic. So let's not confuse. I'll give you 30 seconds to see this. 30 seconds लो और देखो इसको समझो मैंने क्या बताया. कोई confusion, you can ask me here itself. और आपको पता है who activates these P-type ATPases? Who activates these P-type ATPases? Auxins are known to activate these P-type ATPases. ये भी लिख लो. It is the auxins which activate these P-type ATPases. I can tell you so many things. Okay. So the question is, see, let's not get into all this. Simple. Cell wall. And this is the membrane. Outside, more protons. Inside, less protons. So there's a proton gradient which is maintained. And what is present here is IAA. Indole acetic acid is present in the cell wall region. We know in this cell wall region, in the apoplast region, 25% of this IAA which is present in the cell wall, 25% of IAA which is present in the cell wall, this is present in the protonated form. क्योंकि acidic है, H ion will go and combine with IAA negative, it will form a protonated form. How much is present? 25% is present as protonated form in the cell wall. Remaining 75% of oxygen still found in the ionic form or anionic form. This is found in the anionic form in the cell wall region. So the question is, ये जो protonated form है, कौन सी है? IAAH. This is the protonated form. This protonated form has no charge. This has no charge and it can easily pass through the plasma membrane. It can pass through the plasma membrane down the gradient. It can pass through the plasma membrane simply by passive transport. This is a passive transport. Simply down the gradient. ज़्यादा बाहर है, अंदर कम है, membrane के through अंदर आ जाएगा. कोई problem ही नहीं है. क्योंकि it is a protonated form, it has no charge, it can pass through the lipid layer. So 25% indole acetic acid or 25% oxygen can pass through passive transport. No energy needed. No energy is required. But the problem is, what about the 75%? What about the 75% of this oxygen? Because 75% oxygen has a charge. And because it is an ion, it cannot pass through the plasma membrane. So what do we do? बोलो क्या करेंगे? अंदर कैसे आएगा ये? मैंने आपसे कहा कि ऑक्सीजन शोज सेल टू सेल ट्रांसपोर्ट, तो घुसेगा कैसे अंदर सेल के? कहना कितना आसान होता है ना. मैडम ने बोल दिया हाँ चलो ऑक्सीजन शोज बेसिपिटल, लेकिन कैसे हो रहा है? हाउ द मैकेनिज्म टेक्स प्लेस? So what will happen to this 75% oxygen? How it enters inside the cell? How the influx will take place? This is the real enigma. This is the real problem.
सर
Yeah.
सर बट हमें तो शूट में हमें ज्यादा ऑक्सीजन की कंसेंट्रेशन चाहिए. जैसे हम नीचे आ रहे हैं वैसे वैसे हम ऑक्सीजन की कंसेंट्रेशन कम करते रहेंगे. तो सर ये तो हमारे लिए बेनिफिट हो गया ना कि मतलब ये पास नहीं हो पा रहे 75% ऑफ देम.
पास होंगे लेकिन बन कहाँ रहा है? बन तो ऊपर ही रहा है ना. ऊपर से नीचे आने में टाइम
Yes.
तो लगेगा ना. तो
हाँ
क्योंकि
सर
टाइम
बट फिर
लगेगा, दे हैव टू पास थ्रू बैरियर्स. इसीलिए ग्रेडियंट मेंटेन है. ग्रेडियंट इसलिए, अगर फ्री फ्लो होगा तो ग्रेडियंट नहीं होगा.
यस सर वही मतलब यही तो इनहिबिट कर रहा है ना कि इसकी वजह से
मैं
ग्रेडियंट मेंटेन हो रहा है.
मैं इसकी बात नहीं कर रहा हूं. मैं कह रहा हूं चलो नीचे कम है, मैंने मान लिया आपकी बात, लेकिन वो क्रॉस कैसे किया? मैं तो इसकी बात ही नहीं कर रहा कि वो तो मैंने आपको बता ही दिया कि ग्रेडियंट है. My question is
Yes.
not about the gradient. My question is, even if some molecules are present downwards, how they will pass through the cell?
यस सर हाँ ठीक है.
Do you get my point? तो क्या मतलब 75% ऑक्सीजन ऊपर ही अटक जाएगा, वो नीचे नहीं आएगा? तो फिर तो वहां पे वो
Yes,
accumulate
sir.
होता रहेगा. फिर तो शूट तो मोटी हो जाएगी. फिर वहां पे तो बहुत सारा ऑक्सीजन accumulate हो जाएगा फिर तो, अगर वो पास
हाँ
नहीं
सर
करेंगे.
75 बहुत ज्यादा है मतलब 25%. यस सर.
So the question is how this 75% will pass through the, क्योंकि it is present in the anionic form, and that is the real problem that we have. And that is why for this transport of 75% oxygen, which is anionic, it requires active transport. It requires active transporting. ये क्या था? Passive था. मतलब जो protonated form है, this can be transported via passive transport. Passive transport. लेकिन जो बाकी का 75% है, जो anionic form है, to transport this, we need energy, my friend. It requires active transport. Now, how this happens? The question is how this happens. ठीक है? Now, see this. हमने क्या देखा है? To transport this, we have secondary active transporters which are present. तो चलो थोड़ा सा देखते हैं यहाँ पे. कोई घबरा तो नहीं गया? कोई बच्चे ऐसे भी होते हैं जो घबरा जाते हैं. अरे इतना सारा कैसे पढ़ेंगे? if you see, if you have urge to learn, you will enjoy the process. अगर आप पढ़ाई को burden समझोगे, so it will always remain a burden. ठीक है, you should have the urge to learn, the urge for knowledge. Only then you enjoy the process. Okay. तो चलो इसको देखते हैं जरा. See this. Cell wall. This is the membrane. This is the membrane. Okay. Now the question is, हमने क्या देखा है जो membranes हैं, these membranes have special transporters. Membranes have special transporters, and these are carriers. These are carriers. And what carriers are present? We call them as, these are called as what? They are called as proton or 2-proton IAA symporters. We call them as 2-proton IAA symporter, which are nothing else, which are in fact carriers. And what are carriers? Carriers are transport proteins. We know carriers are transport proteins. Transport proteins can be of different types. We can have carriers, we can have permeases, we can have ion channels, we can have pores, we can have pumps, we can have ATPases, we can have aquaporins. क्या है ये? मतलब जो ट्रांसपोर्ट मैकेनिज्म, भाई किसी के पापा स्कूटी से आते हैं, किसी के पापा साइकिल से आते हैं, किसी के पापा हवाई जहाज में आ रहे हैं, सभी ट्रांसपोर्ट ही कर रहे हैं, लेकिन मीडियम्स आर डिफरेंट. Similarly, in the plasma membrane also we have different kinds of transporters, you know. And this is a transporter which is called as carrier, and it is a symporter. Okay. Now the question is how this functions. Okay, it is an active transport. I'm telling you this is active transport. Okay, so see what happens. बाहर क्या है हमारा H-ion ज़्यादा है. There's more H-ion, so there's a proton gradient we know which is present. अंदर में less H-ion. बाहर we have more H-ions in the cell wall region. सारा cell wall है. So more H-ions in the cell wall. So that means there's a gradient of H-ions which is maintained. And at the same time, if you look outside we also have what? We have IA negative, which is more. This is present more. So what happens? As these H-ions move down the gradient, अब ये जो H-ions हैं, they will move down the gradient. बाहर ज़्यादा है, अंदर कम है. So through this symporter, through this carrier, the H-ions will move down the gradient. क्योंकि बाहर ज़्यादा है, अंदर कम है. So as they move down the gradient, some energy is dissipated. Some energy would be released. ATP synthesis में भी तो यही होता है. Mitochondria में क्या होता है? As the H-ions pass through the F0, F1 particle down the gradient, some energy is dissipated, and that energy is used for ATP synthesis. Same is here. As these protons move down the gradient, some energy is dissipated, and that energy is used to bring these IAA negative inside the cell. That energy is used to bring this IAA inside the cell. And that is why this mechanism is called as symporter. It is a sim. Sim matlab ek saath. Two solutes are brought together inside the cell. We call this mechanism as symport. You get my point? Okay? So what is involved in the influx of oxygen? It is a active transport, and we call it secondary active transport. We call it secondary active transport क्योंकि ATP is not directly used. What is used is a proton gradient. अगर यहाँ पे ATP use हो रहा होता transport के लिए, that becomes primary active transport. जैसे मैंने कहा कि plasma membrane has H positive ATPases. They are primary transporters. But यहाँ पे क्या हो रहा है? This is a secondary active transport क्योंकि ATP is not being directly used. So just remember this. Influx of IAA negative requires active transport, which is a secondary active transport, or we call it indirect active transport. Am I clear with this? Okay. So finally, what happens? Finally, for every 2 protons which are brought inside, 1 IA negative is also brought inside. along with 2 protons which come inside, one IAA negative will also enter inside the cell. And recently, we have extracted this symporter in Arabidopsis. ये जो symporter है, this H positive IAA symporter, this has been extracted in the Arabidopsis. And we have given it a name. What do we call? We call it AUX1 protein. What do we call it? AUX1 protein. तो कई बार एग्जाम में पूछा हुआ है कि which transporters are involved in the influx of auxins? And the answer is AUX1 proteins are involved. याद रखो, which proteins are involved in the influx of auxin? Tell me what is the answer. It is the AUX1 proteins. And what is the AUX1? It is nothing else. It is a 2-proton IAA symporter. It is a carrier protein. Am I clear with this?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Sir,
sir.
And
sir,
हाँ जी बोले.
जब हम H+ को इनसाइड द सेल ला रहे हैं तो मतलब हमारा ATP जो है वो प्रोड्यूस हो रहा है.
कहाँ प्रोड्यूस हो रहा है?
नहीं सर.
अगर माइटोकॉन्ड्रिया में होता तो प्रोड्यूस होता ना.
हाँ वही सर, मतलब सर जब H+ अंदर आ रहा है तो वो क्या एनर्जी हमें मिल रही है जिससे IAA हम अंदर ले रहे हैं.
ये जो प्रोटीन है, आपको पता है जब पानी ऊपर से नीचे गिरता है तो आप उससे लाइट बना सकते हो ना.
यस सर.
जब आप साइकिल पहाड़ के नीचे ला रहे हो तो उससे लाइट बनती है ना.
हाँ सर, बनती है.
तो ये जो प्रोटॉन ग्रेडियंट है, this proton gradient has high amount of potential energy. So when
Okay,
these
sir.
protons travel down the electrochemical gradient, when they travel down the electrochemical gradient, some energy would always be dissipated.
Okay,
ठीक
sir.
है? And that energy is used to do certain work. And what is the work? The work is to bring IAA negative inside the cell. So many transporters
Okay.
have this mechanism, you know. ठीक है? तो माइटोकॉन्ड्रिया में भी जो F01 पार्टिकल, उसमें भी सेम चीज ही हो रही है. Is this clear? जैसे हमारे, अगर हम एनिमल्स की बात करें, हमारे इंटेस्टाइन्स में what we have, we know glucose is brought inside the cell. From intestines, glucose is brought inside the cell because we have sodium glucose importers. हमारे intestinal epithelial cells में we have glucose sodium importers. क्योंकि बाहर सोडियम आयन ज्यादा होते हैं तो सोडियम आयन enters inside down the gradient, brings glucose inside. तो plants में भी also we have same mechanisms. Let's not beat around the bush. अगर हम बहुत ज्यादा बात करेंगे, we'll move out of the topic. Okay? Let's stick to the topic. So the question has been asked, which proteins are involved in influx of auxin? You should always know it is AUX1 proteins, and AUX1 proteins are present where? They're present at the upper ends of the epithelial cells. कहाँ पे? Upper ends पे, यहाँ पे. They're present on the upper ends of the or upper surface of the epithelial cells, not on the lower surface. याद रखो. Present on the upper surface. Now, let us see. The question is, चलो, auxin has come inside the cell. चलो, auxin cell के अंदर आ गया. ये हमारी membrane है. चलो, इस बार ये membrane है हमारी, और membrane के बाहर भी है the cell wall. This is the cell wall that we have. This is the plasma membrane. अब auxin यहाँ पे पड़ा हुआ है हमारा. आइए H भी आ गया, आइए नेगेटिव भी आ गया, दोनों ने एंट्री ले ली सेल के अंदर. Both have entered inside the cell. Now, what is the pH of the cytosol? We know the pH of the cytosol is alkaline. So, because pH is alkaline, because we have less number of H ions inside the cell, in that case, even the protonated form will give proton. The protonated form will also be converted to proton दे देगा, it is also converted to IA negative. मतलब cytoplasm में most of the auxin is present as IAA negative. Most of the cytoplasm inside the cell, inside the cytosol is present as what? This is present as IA negative. Am I clear? क्योंकि protonated
Yes.
form will also give its proton, क्योंकि alkaline environment. Now, the question is, now we talk about efflux. Now we talk about efflux. अब जब efflux होगा तो किसका होगा? Efflux would be of anion. Efflux किसका होगा? Only anion has to move out. और ये हमारी प्लाज्मा मेम्ब्रेन है, which is a barrier. So how this auxin moves out of the cell? Influx तो हमने देख लिया, और जब ऑक्सिन बाहर मूव करेगा, इट विल कम टू सेल वॉल, इट विल कम टू द सेल वॉल, जहां से हमने स्टार्ट किया था. अगेन इट विल कम टू सेल वॉल. बट द क्वेश्चन इज हाउ दिस efflux will take place. Again, we have proteins which are involved. Transport protein. So there's a transport protein which is present in the basal membrane. So we have ये question पूछा हुआ एग्जाम में. So we have a transport protein which is present in the basal membrane. और आपने याद रखना है कि again, what is involved in the efflux? We know it is the auxin anion complexes. तो कौन सा प्रोटीन है? We have auxin anion efflux carriers which are involved in the efflux of auxin. So it is the anion efflux carriers which are present on the basal membrane which are involved in the efflux of auxin. And they are localized at the base of the cell. They are found at the base of the cell. कितना आसान है ना? इतना आसान तो नहीं होगा ना? And we know ये जो auxin anion efflux carriers है, they are in fact complexes. They are in fact complexes, you know. So sometimes you call them as auxin anion efflux complex. Carrier की जगह हम क्या कहते हैं? इसको complex भी बोल देते हैं. तो ये जो auxin anion efflux complexes हैं, in fact we know these complexes are present on the basal membrane. ये basal membrane पे ज़्यादा localized है. And this complex is also made up of two proteins. This is also made up of two proteins. So auxin anion efflux complex, which is found on the basal membrane, is also made up of two proteins. Now, a question I have. One of these proteins, which is very important, is called as spin protein. Always keep in mind which proteins are involved in the efflux of auxin. They'll give you this option: spin proteins. Which protein is involved in the influx of auxin? This is the AUX1 protein. Influx, spin proteins, efflux. Any confusion? Now, I am saying two proteins. So one of these proteins is spin proteins, and the second protein, which is part of this complex, this is called as PGP. We call them as PGPs. That is P glycoproteins. That is P glycoproteins. So two proteins are part of the spin proteins as well as PGPs. ठीक है? अब ये जो pin भी है ना, this pin protein which is involved in the efflux and which is localized at the basal membrane, they are also family of proteins. कोई एक protein नहीं है, it is a family of protein, and we know different tissues. In different tissues, we have different members of this pin family. So different tissues have different members of this pin family protein. And they're generally localized at the basal ends. Now, अब देखो बहुत ज्यादा मैं बात करूं आपसे, एक चीज याद रखो, ये जो पिन प्रोटीन्स हैं कहां पड़े हुए हैं, ये देखो, ये है पिन प्रोटीन्स. सो इट इज अ complex, each complex is a pin protein also. So this is a pin protein. Now this pin protein is an integral membrane protein. You know, it is an integral membrane protein. ये भी याद रखो. This is an integral membrane protein. मतलब membrane के अंदर है ये integral membrane protein, मतलब ऐसे प्रेजेंट होगा ये. प्रोटीन है तो मतलब क्या हो जाएगा? पॉलीपेप्टाइड इज प्रेजेंट, मतलब पॉलीपेप्टाइड मेक्स प्रोटीन. तो हम बनाते तो ऐसे हैं इसको, लेकिन होता ऐसे है एक्चुअली. तो दैट मीन्स ये जो पिन प्रोटीन है, वी नो इट हैज 12 ट्रांसमेम्ब्रेन सेगमेंट्स. कितने सेगमेंट्स हैं इसके पास? This question was asked. It has 12 transmembrane segments. The pin protein has 12 transmembrane segment. ठीक है, तो ये चीजें आपने याद रखनी है. अब हम बात करते हैं पीजीपीज की. कोई थक तो नहीं गया? मैंने आपसे शुरू में ही कहा था कि जो हार्मोन्स है ना, ये अपने आप एक सब्जेक्ट है. हम स्कूल में पढ़ते हैं, अच्छा हाँ चलो ये हार्मोन है, मैडम ने 10 पॉइंट लिखा दिए, ऑक्सीजन की वजह से ये होता है, ऑक्सीजन की वजह से वो होता है, बेटा रट्टा लगा लो. आपने रट्टा लगा लिया, फिर अगले दिन भूल गए, बात ही खत्म. कितना सिंपल प्रोसेस है. और उसमें भी गलत करके आ गए, जिबरलिन का ऑक्सीजन में घुसा दिया, ऑक्सीजन का एथाइलिन में घुसा दिया. आज तक समझ में नहीं आया कि हार्मोन्स होते क्या है, कभी याद ही नहीं होते. अगर मैं आपको 60 पॉइंट दे दूं, कह दूं रट्टा लगा लो, आप कभी रट्टा लगा ही नहीं पाओगे. मैं नहीं लगा सकता कभी. ओनली इफ यू नो द स्टोरी दैट यू कैन अंडरस्टैंड फाइटोहार्मोन्स, अदरवाइज इट्स वेरी डिफिकल्ट. प्लांट्स में सबसे डिफिकल्ट टॉपिक फाइटोहार्मोन्स है, पता है आपको, याद ही नहीं होते कभी. इनके अगर रिस्पॉन्सेज आपको याद करने को मैं 10 पॉइंट दे दूं, आप कभी नहीं याद कर पाओगे किस हार्मोन के क्या रिस्पॉन्सेज होते हैं, जब तक कि आपको कहानी नहीं पता है. मैं इसको एक लेक्चर में भी खत्म कर सकता हूं, सबके रिस्पॉन्सेज लिखवा दूं, चलो खत्म हो गया टॉपिक, आई वॉश कर दो इसका. और दूसरी तरफ आई कैन गेट इनटू मॉलिक्यूलर डिटेल्स. तो इट्स अप टू यू. आप मेरा काम आसान करना चाहो, आप आसान कर सकते हो. यू कैन टेल मी सर सुपरफिशियल ले लो, मैं ले लूंगा. मेरे को आसान है कम पढ़ाना, लेकिन आई नॉट बी सेटिस्फाइड. ठीक है, तो वी नो सेकेंड कंपोनेंट ऑफ इफ्लक्स कॉम्प्लेक्स इज व्हाट, पीजीपीज. और ये जो पीजीपीज है, मतलब पी ग्लाइकोप्रोटीन्स. ग्लाइकोप्रोटीन मतलब प्रोटीन प्लस कार्बोहाइड्रेट. मैंने से ग्लाइकोप्रोटीन मतलब प्रोटीन प्लस कार्बोहाइड्रेट. ये जो पीजीपीज हैं, वी नो दे रिक्वायर एटीपी. याद रखो, दे रिक्वायर एटीपी एज सोर्स ऑफ एनर्जी. मतलब जो इफ्लक्स प्रोसेस है ऑक्सीजन का, इट रिक्वायर्स एनर्जी. इफ्लक्स प्रोसेस रिक्वायर्स एनर्जी because PGPs need ATP. They are ATP dependent transporters. मैं ऐसे भी कह सकता हूं कि PGPs are what? They are ATP dependent transporters. ठीक है, and ये जो PGPs हैं, they belong to family of proteins which are called as MDRs. They belong to family of proteins which are called as MDR. Multi-drug resistant. They belong to a family of proteins which call them as MDR, multi-drug resistant. Sometimes we use the term MDR PGPs. MDR PGPs. मैं बहुत ज्यादा मॉलिक्यूलर लेवल पर जाऊंगा तो you'll be confused. So they belong to family of proteins. We call them as MDR PGPs. Animals में also we have these MDRs. It's not only plants. In animals also we have multi-drug resistant proteins. We have seen, we normally study in animals only these MDRs, but plants also have MDRs. But there's one difference, in plants and animals. अगर हम MDRs की बात animals में करें, MDRs की बात हम plants में करें, animals के केस में जो multi-drug resistant proteins होते हैं, they are non-specific in nature. Non-specific. मतलब आप भी इसके अंदर घुस सकते हो, मैं भी घुस सकता हूं, हमारे राजस्थान वाले बच्चे भी घुस सकते हैं, सारे इसके अंदर से चले जाएंगे. मतलब दे आर नॉन स्पेसिफिक. लेकिन प्लांट्स में ये जो पीजीपीज हैं व्हिच आर एमडीआरस, दे आर हाईली स्पेसिफिक फॉर ऑक्सीजन. दे आर ओनली स्पेसिफिक फॉर ऑक्सीजन्स. They are only specific for oxygen. So there's a major difference in plants and animals in these MDRs which are present. Okay, but the question is now see this diagram. अब यहां पे देखो ये क्या है, ये वाला पिन प्रोटीन था. This is what is PGP. This is a PGP. So you can see here this is the complex. So this is one complex. This complex has two proteins. One is PGP, one is pin protein. Now how these PGPs function is still not clear. How this PGP functions in oxygen transport, we have no idea. Still not clear how these PGPs function in oxygen transport. ठीक है. And एक चीज और याद रखनी है आपको, ये जो PGPs हैं, these PGPs are found to be uniformly distributed. जैसे पिन प्रोटीन्स तो हमारे सिर्फ नीचे पड़े हुए हैं, लेकिन पीजीपीज जो हैं दे आर यूनिफॉर्मली डिस्ट्रीब्यूटेड थ्रू आउट द प्लाज्मा मेम्ब्रेन. तो ये भी पीजीपी है, ये भी पीजीपी है. सो दे आर यूनिफॉर्मली डिस्ट्रीब्यूटेड. बट लोअर एंड्स पे, बेसल एंड्स पे, they form a complex with pin proteins. Otherwise, they are uniformly distributed throughout the plasma membrane. But how they function in oxygen transport, no clarity. But what we know is कि जो PGPs हैं at lower ends, they function synergistically with pin proteins. There's some kind of synergy, there's some kind of coordination with pin proteins. So basal ends where these PGPs, what they say is that they function synergistically. So they function synergistically with pin proteins at lower ends or at basal ends to establish a directionality of oxygen transport. So they establish a directionality of oxygen transport. Okay. So this is what we know about the oxygen transport. बात समझ में आ गई? So this is what we know about the oxygen transport. ठीक है. तो मैंने अभी आपसे क्या कहा, तो अगर मैं सेल की बात करूं, ये प्लाज्मा मेम्ब्रेन है, क्योंकि सेल वॉल का तो कोई रोल ही नहीं होता ना, प्लाज्मा मेम्ब्रेन. तो मैंने कहा दिस इज द प्लाज्मा मेम्ब्रेन. तो प्लाज्मा मेम्ब्रेन में अपर सरफेस में इनफ्लक्स प्रोटीन्स, लोअर सरफेस में इफ्लक्स प्रोटीन्स. और जो इफ्लक्स प्रोटीन्स हैं दे आर प्रेजेंट एज कॉम्प्लेक्सेस. वन इज अ पीजीपी एंड वन इज अ पिन प्रोटीन. ऊपर वाले सरफेस में भी है ऑक्स1, और जो पीजीपीज है दे आर यूनिफॉर्मली डिस्ट्रीब्यूटेड. यहां पे भी है, दिस इज अ पीजीपी. सो दिस इज द सिनेरियो दैट वी हैव. बट यू वुड थिंक, आपको ये लगेगा ये हमारे पिन प्रोटीन्स. यू वुड थिंक कि पिन प्रोटीन्स आर ओनली फाउंड इन द लोअर सरफेस. व्हाट वी हैव आल्सो फाउंड, आई टोल्ड यू इट इज अ फैमिली ऑफ प्रोटीन्स. पिन प्रोटीन्स आर फैमिली. व्हाट वी हैव फाउंड कि सम ऑफ दीस पिन प्रोटीन्स, फॉर एग्जांपल वी हैव पिन 3, पिन 1, पिन 2, पिन 3. ये जो पिन 3 प्रोटीन है, this is also found on the lateral walls, lateral membranes. तो pin 3 जो प्रोटीन है, this is also present in the lateral membranes. That means it can also move out oxygen laterally. ये oxygen को lateral भी transfer कर सकता है. But mainly they are localized at the lower ends only. But ऐसा नहीं है कि they're only. We know some of them are also found on the lateral membranes. For example, we have pin 3. Keep this in mind. ठीक है. So now you have understood. हाँ जी बोलो. बेटा आवाज नहीं आ रही, आवाज नहीं आ रही आपकी.
टेस्ट भी डोज सर, पीजीपीस.
हाँ बोलो बोलो.
सर वही आवाज है.
क्या कह रहे हो? मैं बाद में लेता हूँ. I'll take your doubt later. अभी आवाज नहीं आ रही आपकी. I'll take your doubt later. Now see, I'll take your doubt later. Now see, the question is, what you have to understand here, कि अब तक हमने बात करी ऑक्सीजन ट्रांसपोर्ट की. ऑक्सीजन ट्रांसपोर्ट थ्रू व्हाट? ऑक्सीजन ट्रांसपोर्ट थ्रू, दिस इज xylem parenchyma cells. xylem parenchyma cells. हम ऑक्सीजन ट्रांसपोर्ट की बात कर रहे थे फ्रॉम शूट टिप टू रूट टिप. वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट द यूनिडायरेक्शनल ऑक्सीजन ट्रांसपोर्ट. वी हैव जस्ट टॉक्ड अबाउट द पोलर ऑक्सीजन ट्रांसपोर्ट. पोलर ऑक्सीजन ट्रांसपोर्ट. ठीक है, where xylem parenchyma cells are involved. But there's a problem, बहुत बड़ी, हर चीज का बहुत बड़ा पर्सपेक्टिव हो सकता है. We also have leaves in the plants, and I told you leaves are also one of the major sites of oxygen production. भाई यहाँ पे भी तो ऑक्सीजन प्रोडक्शन हो रहा है. तो शूट टिप का तो समझ में आता है, जो शूट टिप में ऑक्सीजन प्रोड्यूस हो रहा है, that travels by polar transport. But what about the oxygen which is produced in the leaves? अब देखो एग्जाम्स में ऐसे ही आता है कि ऑक्सीजन शोज पोलर ट्रांसपोर्ट, लेकिन अगर आप अंदर घुसेंगे ना So the statement is wrong. We know the auxin which is produced in the leaves, it does not show polar transport, no polar transport. It does not show polar transport. In fact, the auxin which is produced in the leaves can be transported bidirectionally. Bidirectionally. And it is transported via phloem. कैसे transport हो रहा है? Transported via phloem. बाकी वाला जाइलम के थ्रू जा रहा था, ये phloem के थ्रू जा रहा है भाई साहब. And it is transported bidirectionally. मतलब ये यहाँ से ऊपर भी जा सकता है. It can go to shoot tip also, and it can from here go to root tip also. So do you think it shows unidirectional transport? No. It can be transported bidirectionally also. So auxin transport in plants is more complicated, in fact. It can move up और ऊपर जाके देखो shoot tip पे चला गया. Auxin leaves में produce हो रहा है, goes to the shoot tip, and again it becomes part of the polar transport. It can become part of the polar transport. The auxin of leaves through phloem reaches the shoot tip, and again it becomes part of the unidirectional polar transport. ये फिर xylem में enter कर जाता है. So it is more, picture is more complicated. And एक चीज और याद रखो, जो auxin transport in phloem है ना, its velocity is much higher. It moves at a very faster rate. Very fast rate. So it moves at high velocity. So shows bidirectional movement, moves via phloem, high velocity of movement. So all these aspects of the auxin transport. बात समझ में आ गई? किसी के कोई डाउट्स? तो finally, before we end it up, एक चीज याद रखो, sometimes the examiner is very smart. He'll ask you inhibitors of auxin transport. He'll ask you inhibitors of auxin transport. ठीक है? तो जो inhibitors of auxin transport है, we can again divide it into two: synthetic compounds, and we have the natural compounds. Some of the natural compounds are also inhibitors. So let us first see synthetic compounds, which are the inhibitors of auxin transport. So छोटे नाम देखो इनके. One is called as CPD, one is called as TIBA, one is called as NOA, ठीक है? One is called as NPA. All these are inhibitors of auxin transport. What is CPD? सुन लो मेरी बात. CPD full form: 2-carboxyl phenyl 3-phenyl propane 1,3-dione. याद कर पाओगे?
दोबारा बोलना.
This is 2-carboxyphenyl 3-phenyl propane 1,3-dione. तो इतना लंबा नाम ना कभी आएगा. Just remember CPD. और इसका जो छोटा नाम है, sometimes we call it cyclopropyl propane dione. And that is why we call it CPD. Cyclopropyl propane dione. So this is what is CPD. Then we have TIBA. What is TIBA? This is 2,3,5-tridobenzoic acid. What is this? 2,3,5-tridobenzoic acid. This is what is TIBA. Okay. And then we have NOA. What is this NOA? Which is an inhibitor of auxin transport. This is 1-naphthoxyacetic acid. One naphthoxyacetic acid. This is what is NOA. And then we have NPA. This is 1,N-naphthyl thalamic acid. PTH, 1-naphthyl thalamic acid. So all these are different inhibitors or of oxygen transport. But if I am smart enough, I'll ask you, inhibitor of which one? Influx or efflux? Yeah, both.
Excuse me, sir.
हाँ जी बोलिए.
So what is the full form of NPA?
The full form of NPA, one, ये लिखा हुआ ना, 1N neptyl thalamic acid. ठीक है?
Thank you, sir.
Now the question is, ये जो inhibitors हैं, CPD, TIBA, NOAA, NPA, ये inhibitors किसके हैं? जब मैं ऑक्सीजन ट्रांसपोर्ट की बात कर रहा हूं तो इनफ्लक्स के या इफ्लक्स के या दोनों के? See what you have to remember कि only NOAA, I'll mark it here. ये जो NOAA है, this is the only inhibitor. This is the only inhibitor of oxygen influx. ये influx का inhibitor है. The others, CPD, TIBA, NPA, they're all inhibitors of efflux. They are inhibitors of efflux. Am I clear? अब देखते हैं नेचुरल कंपाउंड. अब तो हमने सिंथेटिक देखा था, नेचुरल. अब नेचुरल कंपाउंड में we have a compound which is called as quercetin. There's a compound called as quercetin, which is in fact a flavonoid. By nature, it is a flavonoid, and flavonoids we know in plants are secondary metabolites. They are secondary metabolites. Okay. The quercetin we know is one of the inhibitors of oxygen transport. Kiska? This is the inhibitor of efflux. So this is efflux inhibitor. Okay. So what we have seen today, we have seen about the basics of the oxygens, different kinds of oxygens, how they are synthesized, where they are synthesized, and how they are transported. Okay. Oxygen में a very important part of oxygen is oxygen transport, where there's a lot of confusion. इतनी क्लैरिटी कहीं नहीं है. तो अभी हमें पता है कि ऑक्सीजन ट्रांसपोर्ट हमारा लीफ से भी होता है, which is bidirectional. ठीक है, which occurs via phloem. We know it can take place through the stem and the roots, which is polar, which takes place through the xylary parenchyma cells. All that we have seen. What is basipetal, acropetal.